problems with this account, though, that while Agrippina was killed in 59, Nero did not marry Poppaea until 3 years later, so the link between the two events seems dicey at best, and probably reflects an echo effect of the earlier incident with Claudia Acte. Others have argued that it was Agrippina's apparent support for one of Nero's cousins, Gaius Rubellius Plautus, that finally did her in. This claim, which echoes the incident with Britannicus, seems to be more plausible, as it represented a clear political threat to Nero, rather than just more insufferable meddling from his overbearing mother. Whatever the cause, Nero set himself upon a course of matricide. According to the ancient sources, though, things did not exactly come off without a hitch. Depending on who you listen to, Nero tried and failed 3 times to have her poisoned, tried once to rig the ceiling above her bed to collapse while she slept, and once succeeded in shipwrecking a boat she was on, only to find out later that she had swum to safety. In the end, he abandoned his attempt to frame her death as an accident and sent an assassin to simply stab her to death. This time, the attempt was successful. According to legend, her last words were, "Smite my wound." But as they say, you can't really close the barn door after the horses have already taken off. Nero announced that his mother had been discovered plotting against his life, and that in response to the discovery, she had committed suicide. No one believed it, of course, but that's what the official story was. The unofficial story was that for years afterwards, Nero was racked with guilt and believed that he was being haunted by the ghost of his murdered mother. Next week, we'll delve into the eventful years of Nero's reign after the death of Agrippina. The 60s AD proved to be a turbulent time for Rome, as revolts broke out in Judea and Britannia, and the Parthian Empire decided to take advantage of the young and inexperienced emperor of Rome by encroaching on the Roman borders in the east. And this is to say nothing of the Great Fire that devastated Rome itself in 65 AD, through which Nero is famously said to have fiddled his way through. But we all know now that this story could not possibly be true, because Nero did not play the fiddle. He played the lyre. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you are now fully aware, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 60,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again is audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you will qualify for a free book download. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book download. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I'm going to recommend picking up The Roman Empire, a very short introduction, which I just discovered and haven't read or listened to yet, but it's by Christopher Kelly, who is a lecturer at the University of Cambridge and a scholar of late antiquity, so I'm going to go out on a limb in saying that it's probably pretty good. He has also written books on Attila the Hun and the administration of the late Roman Empire, both of which I imagine will figure prominently in my research as I try to make sense of the post-Constantine Roman Empire. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 65, Burn It to the Ground. Last week, a 16-year-old Nero ascended to the throne and, after spending a brief period dominated by his mother and other influential advisors, emerged as his own man. Maybe that's too strong a reading, as it conjures up images of Augustus or Tiberius emerging as their own men, which implies a degree of independent competence that Nero never really attained, but he had definitely passed a point where it became dangerous to exert too much overt control over the emperor. If nothing else, Nero had to think he was the man in charge, even if his policies were usually influenced on the front end and executed on the back end by men with their own agendas. Not that these separate agendas were nefarious, mind you. A lot of that backroom influencing resulted in the reining in of Nero's impulsiveness and making sure his grandiose declarations were always interpreted in as sound and practical a manner as possible. It would be a few years yet before the men who were a positive influence on the young emperor were replaced by men who encouraged Nero to embrace the darker side of his character for their own ends. This week, though, I want to move away from the cutthroat politics of the imperial court and focus instead on the foreign pressures the empire faced during the first half of Nero's reign. Because right off the bat, Rome's enemies took one look at the untested 16-year-old emperor and decided that now was the perfect time to push Rome around. In the east, the Parthians took advantage of the situation to strengthen their position in Armenia, the semi-independent buffer state that had been the source of so much conflict over the years. While the Romans dealt with rising tensions and then eventually all-out war with the Parthians, a revolt in the newly acquired province of Britannia would break out, led by the warrior Queen Boudica, that would erupt with such ferocious energy that for a while Nero considered just abandoning the island altogether. Eventually, though, the uprising in Britannia would be put down and a settlement reached with the Parthians. Both conflicts left a lot of lingering resentment and unanswered questions about the future, but all in all, Nero's response to these threats earned him a solid C, maybe even a C+ in foreign policy. He didn't gain any territory, but he didn't lose any territory either, though his critics did accuse him of essentially giving up Rome's hegemony over Armenia when the final deal with Parthia was signed. But I would argue that the agreement, which averted continuous war with Parthia, actually goes down on the credit rather than the debit side of Nero's ledger. Trouble in the east began to bubble to the surface at the end of Claudius's reign. Since the time of Augustus, a deal had been worked out between Rome and Parthia, whereby Rome retained the right to appoint the monarch of Armenia, this nominally independent buffer state. The arrangement worked out fine until the early 50s AD, when the Roman-nominated king was overthrown by his own nephew. The nephew turned out to be a terrible ruler, and the people of Armenia soon grew to despise him. The new king of Parthia, Vologases I, saw what was going on in Armenia and decided that he could make his mark on history by prying the country away from the Romans. So, skillfully parlaying disgust with the sitting king into support for a Parthian alternative, Vologases invaded Armenia and installed his own brother Tiridates on the throne. After a few years of back and forth between the rival claimants, the people of Armenia backed Tiridates, and in 54 AD, the Parthians found themselves effectively ruling Armenia. 54 AD is also, of course, the year that Claudius died and Nero became emperor, making the eastern encroachment of the Parthians one of the first major tests of the new emperor's mettle. Being young and wanting to make a mark himself, Nero was convinced to push back hard against the Parthians. To spearhead this pushback, Nero appointed a man named Gnaeus Domitius Corbulo, a general who had made a name for himself battling the always active Germanic tribes during the reigns of Caligula and Claudius. Corbulo was made propraetor and later proconsul of the provinces of Cappadocia and Galatia, and instructed to gather and train an army that could be put in the field against the Parthians should diplomatic overtures fail. As he gathered his forces, though, it became apparent that the bulk of whatever force he led would be drawn from the legions stationed in Syria. So for the next few years, while Rome waited for Parthia to back down and Parthia waited for Rome to give up, Corbulo trained his men, going so far as to keep them encamped throughout the winter to get them ready for the harsh conditions they would find in mountainous Armenia. The basic demand of the Romans was simple. Tiridates had to travel to Rome and receive an official endorsement from the emperor. Otherwise, his presence on the Armenian throne would be considered illegitimate and an act of war. The Parthians hemmed and hawed, and so finally, in 58 AD, Corbulo was given the green light to begin pressing the Roman case by other means. Tiridates had scattered his defense forces across Armenia to avoid the decisiveness that comes with a single large battle. So rather than invading the country with a single column, Corbulo sent in dozens of small detachments and simultaneously ordered the Roman allied kings along the Armenian border to begin stirring up trouble. If he couldn't knock Tiridates out with a single punch, Corbulo was content to do it with 1,000 cuts. At first, things went well for Rome, and in short order, the swarming legions caused Tiridates to demand a meeting. The two sides agreed to come together, but when the Armenians showed up with 1,000 men and the Romans showed up with 3,000 men, Tiridates got spooked and took off in the middle of the night, convinced that he was about to be ambushed. The Armenians then tried to cut off the supply line of the legions, the tactic that had brought Mark Antony to his knees, but Corbulo had studied his military history, was well defended. Unable to make a dent against the Roman invasion, Tiridates fell back into a defensive posture, leading Corbulo to recall his own scattered forces and prepare them for a series of traditional assaults on the main Armenian strongholds. Encountering little real resistance, the Romans captured city after city on their way to the northern capital of Artashata, where Tiridates had holed up. The Armenian king dispatched everything he had against the besieging Roman forces, but he was unable to break their line. Tiridates was forced to flee and abandon his capital. Unable to garrison the city properly, Corbulo burned it to the ground. The next year, the legions headed towards Tigrana-Serta, the capital of southern Armenia. It was a difficult road, and along the way at least one plot to assassinate the hard-driving Corbulo was exposed. The conspirators, mostly allied Armenians who had grown tired of following the Romans, were all executed. The affair actually turned out pretty well for the targeted Roman general, not only because he survived, but also because, when he arrived outside of Tigrana-Serta, it is reported that he launched one of the conspirators' heads into the city, reminding the leaders of the capital what happened to those who defied Rome. The ruling council voted to surrender without a fight. By the end of 59 AD, Tiridates was on the run, and Corbulo crowned Tigranes VI as the new king of Armenia. Having successfully ejected the Parthians from this key territory with only minimal losses, Corbulo was hailed as a hero back in Rome and became the most celebrated general of his generation. As a reward for his achievement, the victorious Corbulo was given the governorship of Syria, the most important province in the Eastern Empire, aside from Egypt, of course. He left a legion garrisoned in Armenia to support the new king and headed south to his new assignment, believing that the Armenian question had now been answered. But it was not to be so. As it would turn out, Corbulo's victories came so easily because, while the Romans were intensely focused on the conflict in Armenia, Vologases and the Parthians were being pulled in a dozen different directions, dealing with nasty revolts both out on their frontiers and within their royal family itself. Stretched so thin, Parthia was unable to supply Tiridates with the resources he needed to successfully ward off the Roman assault. But in 61 AD, following probably ill-advised raids into Parthia by Tigranes VI, things changed. There was no way Vologases could ignore such an insult. Settling his other internal problems so as not to be distracted, the Romans soon discovered that they had earned Parthia's full attention. From here on out, things would not be so easy. Just as things were about to get dicey in the east, a revolt in Britannia exploded with such force that Nero and his advisors seriously considered just giving up the island completely. At what point, they wondered, will it simply no longer be worth it to hold this cold and foggy island on the edge of the world? But as quickly as it started, the revolt flamed out. However, had Gaius Suetonius Paulinus lost the Battle of Watling Street, which, given how outnumbered he was not entirely out of the question, there is a very real possibility that the Romans would have withdrawn from Britain completely, altering the course of Western European history in the process. The trouble began in either 60 or 61 AD, no one seems sure of the actual date, when Prasutagus, the king of the Iceni, died. During the initial Roman invasion of Britain in 43, the Iceni, who hailed from modern-day Norfolk on the east coast of Britain, had either been one of the 11 tribes who surrendered to Claudius, or they had worked out an independent peace with the Romans not long after. However it happened, the Iceni had been able to maintain their independence